Herwig Baumgartner is co-founder and principal of the architecture firm B+U. They have been widely featured and discussed in many publications, I'm not going to list them all, and in both television and radio interviews. In 2010, B+U published their first monograph titled Vector Fields and were awarded the Maxine Frankel Award for Design Research. B+U's work was recently exhibited at the 12th Architecture Biennale in Venice, the Architecture and Design Museum in Los Angeles, the AIA Emerging Professional Exhibition in Washington, D.C., the Stadtkron 2030 exhibition in Milan, the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, at the Audience of Objects exhibition at SCI-Arc, Los Angeles, and the CCRD in Hollywood. Herwig has been a visiting professor at UCLA, and he currently teaches graduate and undergraduate design studios, as well as applied studies seminar at SCI-Arc. Herwig is the newly appointed Applied Studies Coordinator. This is how I would describe the work. You can't find it deep in the ocean, or if you look up at the sky. It's not embedded in a wall or drawn on a facade. Not defined as an animal, although it might rumble or roar, we can't call it music. I couldn't find the score. It's not really tectonics, the seams have been erased. It was a thought which was then made, so architecture must be its fate. Herwig, thank you for sitting down with me today.
Thank you. Very nice poem.
What would you consider was your first architectural project?
I would probably say there's probably many, but the first one that comes to mind was probably in the middle of my undergrad education. It was a library project for Jussieu in Paris, which was a competition, by the way, that Ram won. We did that as a studio project, and it's like, I think, for having been a student, or at that time, you always have that moment as a student where things are clicking, and so that was one of those projects where things really clicked for me, where I, for the first time, figured out how to get it together in one project, and you learn a lot from that. I think you kind of go afterwards and look back at it and say, what happened? How did it happen? And it's a little difficult to recreate, but I think it's that kind of first experience when you get the taste of it, and that keeps you going.
Could you maybe describe the project and then how it maybe affected your work later on, if it did?
The project was kind of, for me, on the crossroads between, just a little bit to give a little bit of background. I had a music background when I entered the Angewandte in Vienna, which is the architecture school or art school, and I was studying music at the same time. So for me, I finished my diploma in electronic music at that time. So that project I was struggling, kind of trying to figure out how this has nothing to do with each other, or it has something to do with each other. And that project kind of allowed me to link them in a way that were most beneficial for the architecture, I would say. So it started out with something that was very graphic, almost like a notation. You could call it a drawing. And then a technique of how that was transformed into a skin envelope, a project for the library. And there was kind of like a multi-directional branching type of project. There was a lot of graphic on it that was chopped up and cut up, etc. But I think as a concept for the library, less programmatically, but more like how you produce something on the site that's very difficult, I would say. The Jussieu site is. It's a library. It's a university in Paris that has a long history, obviously, in terms of student revolution in the 60s. But it's a grid. It's a grid structure that's raised off the floor. So how do you plug into that grid? So it's a very strong kind of massing on the site. How do you relate to it? And how do you produce something new, kind of riffing off of that idea? So I think on multiple levels, that was an important project for me from that viewpoint.
You have an interest in responsive systems. Is this done for an experimental effect or a functional?
I'm less interested in the functional part, probably. um, it probably interests me more conceptually, I would say, and then at the point what the overall sensation is. I'm less interested in like, does it work really well? Like I do this and that happens. It's not a technical thing. So it's more it's a tool maybe, and even often we disguise the sensors and things like this. So it's not immediate, or it's not an instant gratification, but it's one that you may have to think a little bit about it and spend a little bit more time with it, which that would be my critique on the responsive system that are instant. That's very much like, you give them a tool, you show them how to push the button, and then here we go. And then you're done with it. So our responsive systems are they're a little bit more intelligence built into it. So they may change the behavior depending on how much and how intensely you want to engage with them.
Keeping on the topic of interactive, can a form or a material create an interactive environment? Or does sensors have to be installed to create a reactionary trigger?
No, you don't need sensors, I would say. I mean, that just has been I would say, one area. I would say quite the opposite. I think something, you shouldn't need that for it to be really engaging on that level. I mean, I think materiality has a lot to do with it. I think form has a lot to do with it. I think how you approach and choreography the entrance or approach to the object has a lot to do with it. I mean, those are all very architectural kind of methods or elements that's our profession, and obviously we're deeply engaged in that. But on top of that, we are interested in an augmentation through other means, and that could be electronic means, through projection or through sound, but it could also be just in a very material level or on a tectonic level.
It's interesting when you talk about elements and tectonics, because when we look at your projects, it seems that we can't really recognize traditional elements in architecture. What roles do traditional elements of architecture play on the way you've dissolved them or made them disappear in your projects?
Well, we have looked at different components or elements of an object or a building. One is definitely the ground and how an object sits on the ground or relates to it, its edges to the side, conditions of like that kind of nature. And then we have looked at different componentry like apertures, which has been kind of a few years or almost of research and trying to figure out how we can redefine this and what this really means. I mean, we like to actually look at those traditional elements of architecture, not to be. What's the ground? What's a column? What's a surface? And how is it traditionally being used, and how do we want to use it, and how can we change the kind of paradigm of that? So, I mean, just on the example of apertures, we have been doing a whole series of projects where we looked at very basic things, actually, like what's a window frame and how do we define that? What's the relationship of an aperture to the surface or to the overall mass? So there's an exterior kind of like componentry to it. What's its relationship to the inside? How do they relate to floors and levels and things like this? And then there's a sort of an ornamentation or articulation of the aperture itself. What should it do besides being an opening in the building? Can it become a driver for a project? Is it strong enough? What can it do, etc.? So it's really looking at this kind of componentry or tool set of architecture. One is mass, the other is the ground. Aperture is one of them. To kind of reinvestigate what this means for us. And I mean, this is kind of an ongoing thing. I think you're looking at precedents of architecture that you have a relationship to or you're in love with, and then you see how meaningful this is for your own work, and how your own work can change some of those paradigms or enhance them. You know.
Talking about apertures and to elaborate on them, what role does emphasizing the aperture have versus the role of its effect on the building have?
Well, to be honest with you, I mean, for us, we have stayed away from housing projects for a long time. And the reason why, well, one of the reasons why, is because for me, a housing project or an aggregate of units that are repetitive to some degree has to do with windows. So if you know how to do a window, you know how to do housing, I would argue, which is kind of a backwards way of looking at housing. But I think that's kind of an important feature that relates to that. And so, so we did a lot of museums, concert halls, all kinds of things that really ignored and actually went through great lengths to erase the aperture altogether. We did that for a number of years, where it was very much about the mass and the massing of the building being as cohesive as possible. So there was a logic that was shaping and forming openings, but that always was related to the overall geometry of the building mass. Now, you know, bringing aperture into the discussion totally changed that attitude towards it, because the aperture is something in our case that's being inserted into a mass, completely independent, so has its own logic, can be designed outside of any kind of like mass or building and then inserted back into it. And then the question is, when that happens, there might be a local reaction to that element. So it's an intrusive element in a way that works on a larger building mass. So for us, that was an important shift, but really was triggered by trying to do housing.
You draw inspiration from nature as a system and sometimes as geometry. Do things that are influenced by nature have to look organic or reveal their sense of biomimicry?
No, and I actually have to say that we never really consciously were saying, you know, let's do biomimicry or any of that. That was never really an interest. There was, I mean, certainly there is a relationship, but I would say that's more tangential. And also I would say this is probably something we have been, at least in our recent work, trying to steer away from. Just because, I mean, this kind of ties into a topic that we have been recently mostly engaged with, which have to do with the familiar and the uncanny, is that if something becomes so easily recognizable, meaning it's missing a level of abstraction, that becomes problematic for us. You know, just we don't look at our own work that way, and but sometimes it's good to look at it that way. So, you know, to kind of correct in a way how you're dealing with that. So, I mean, as I said, like that's kind of like what we are currently kind of pushing towards.
What role does the uncanny play in the way we perceive architecture, and why is it important to reintroduce the uncanny into architecture?
I'm not sure the uncanny ever left, actually, but I would say this, that for us, the kind of the dichotomy between the familiar and the unfamiliar, meaning something that you easily recognize as, that's that, to something where you go like, I'm not sure what is wrong with this picture, meaning there's a kind of like closeness between a readability of an object, for example, you know, that seems familiar, but something is off. And I think there's a whole series of architectural projects that we, and if I say we, this is Scott, Yuryu, and myself, which are B+U, Baumgartner and Yuryu, have been interested over the last few years, is kind of like how, for example, there's projects like Sharon's Philharmonic building in Berlin, which for me is a very uncanny building. And I mean, part of this is interpretive, and I can elaborate a little bit more on that, why it is. But it has moments of uncertainty in it where you're not sure how what you're experiencing is being produced, right? So it's a complicated form or object, or sometimes a space, that is not instantly consumable, right? Which I would say is a big issue for us in terms of like how architecture is being PR'd today, which is, you usually have that single shot that's being taken of your project that's then being published, and that is the kind of like the channel how people, they look at your project, go like, I got that, and checked off and move on. So, I mean, a little bit is kind of like, how do we get out of this? And architecture really isn't that, because if that's what you deliver, then very often if you go to the project, it really is like the air is let out, right? So there's nothing, if there's just that shot and there's nothing else to discover, nothing else to see, then it's kind of uninteresting, for us. And so I think this is more on a general level. I mean, I also think that's kind of, for me, the kind of art we're looking at has a lot to do with that too. It's usually to introduce a level of complexity that makes it difficult to not to obstrude the understanding of the object, but really to kind of like pull somebody in and engage somebody with it. And I think architecture, good architecture, very much does that. And it does it by different means, but one of them for us is this kind of relationship between something that we are familiar with and something that becomes very unfamiliar, sometimes not spooky, but uncanny, so.
It's interesting to hear you talk about audiences and perception. If you come from a music background where music is considered universal, everyone,
right,
quote unquote, gets it.
Right.
Whereas architecture seems to be more of a professional, disciplinary thing that you get or you don't get depending on how much involvement you have within the discourse. How do those two things play when you look at audiences and projects?
Well, there's different kinds of audiences, I would say. There is, and that's, I would say it's the same is true for architecture. I mean, there's people that, architectural tourism, they go look at projects. They may or may not be architects, but they may have an interest in it. But the observation is true that music is built upon a performance experience. And it's built upon the idea that to keep people engaged, meaning you need a good beginning and a good ending, and that's also true for architecture. But you also need a strong middle section. So you need to kind of like think, and not that I want to think of sort of building that way, but it is somewhat true that that type of thinking, both Scott and I have a music background, kind of influences often how we talk about projects, like, how do I get in? What's the entry and what does that look and feel like? How do I move through the space? What is the kind of like big payoff? Or is there multiples that, so there is things of choreography that are important to how there's a certain sequence, or sometimes there's multiple sequences of how you move through it. And I think it's just a way of how we think about design too. We then go through these sequences and start looking at how to design them, basically.
Turning back into the object, could you talk about the effect you're trying to achieve by blurring or shredding the silhouette of an object?
Yeah, there's something that always bothers me. I mean, about the object, the clearly defined object, because it is, and maybe that's has also something to do with so the crispness of an edge means to me there's a certain absoluteness to the shape. And so there's a lot of architects that celebrate that. And I would say most probably do. In art, not so much. Like there is artists that deal with the fundamentalists, that deal with like very absolute kind of geometry and edges and not really interested in it. But then there's also the kind of artists we're interested in, like Tim Hawkinson or Matthew Barney or people of that kind of nature that are interested in the iconography of a pure primitive form, with the caveat that they are then modifying its edges to become what I would call blurred or not really clear. So I'm not really talking about transitioning the object into the landscape, not at all. I'm actually more interested in not being able to always put your hand on the silhouette of something, right? The silhouette, I think, is it's obviously, it's everywhere. It shapes our cities and skies lines, but that's exactly something that's, for me, was taking apart or challenging. I mean, to give you a good example, Gary's high-rise in New York, the Beekman Tower, for me is mostly successful as you're coming from Brooklyn across the bridge. When it shows up in the skyline, and it is a very strange appearance, right? It's like it's not very clear. It doesn't fit in the monolithicness of Manhattan. It's just there's something off with the way how its edges work, and so. I mean, other examples of that nature exist a lot in art, but we are very much interested in that kind of. It's not really a solvable problem, but it's an interesting one.
You have explored many materials over the years. Is that a result of material interest or the project's need for new materiality?
I would say both. I mean, part of it has to do with that we feel like if you're working on what you would at least think of your own work as trying to break into new territory, I think to solve it with the quote-unquote conventional materials that we have always makes the thing a little bit banal is maybe not the right word, but it kind of it incorporates it. It makes it it's like, so you have a complicated geometry. That doesn't necessarily mean it needs to have different materiality, but often those two need each other anyway, because in order just figuring out a way how to build it. For example, we're doing this house right now in the Hollywood Hills that is a fiberglass house, essentially, and in part of it because of its geometry, but also in the other aspect of it has a lot to do with what it feels and looks like. So you could do this house out of many materials probably. You could pour it out of concrete, or you could probably bend it out of steel and do other things with it. But it's, then it's, I think this has more to do with like the sensation of how you perceive architecture. Materiality is a very important part of that. Do you want a smooth surface or something that has a different kind of character, and then what is that character and how can you achieve it? I think it's much more productive to think about it in those kind of terms, and to push that. I think if you just fall back into presets, we all know what that looks like. So that's basically somebody knows how to make geometry but doesn't really know how to make architecture. There's a big difference there.
Talking about materiality, let's talk about structure as well. Your formal interests have been well documented. Does structure follow these forms, or is there an interest in structural innovation as well?
Well, our interest in structure is very peculiar, I would say. I mean, we're definitely not a firm that embraces structure for structure's sake. Often we actually do try to erase it altogether, so it's not structure is not in the foreground. I would say, maybe on the Aperture project that we did for that tower in Lima, Peru, I would call it a structural project, but not in terms of like a primary structure more in the sense of how do you engineer something that's dynamic, meaning something that moves, which is a different type of engineering than structure engineers trying to stabilize your project, making it not move. So how do you introduce things like this, like subtle movements or things actually having some flexibility to it. I mean, that's very much then ties into material composites, obviously a big part of this, but also silicons, 3D printing, things like of that nature that are much more related to the medical field, prosthetics and things like this are very interesting to us because motion is built into the design of those things, and it's a limited amount of motion, and but it's an area that we haven't really dug really deep into it, but that we're very interested in.
I want to shift to a more specific point about fabrication of color, which comes from your aperture installation at SCI-Arc. What's the difference between choosing a material of a certain color and choosing a clear material where you then had to apply color to it? So the painted white and your clear plastic that you've chosen for your aperture installation.
Well, I would say this, the way how we are, I mean, we're definitely not the most colorful office, but if we did try to implement it, I'm not sure I understand your question correctly, but the way how we tried to implement it, the aperture installation at SCI-Arc was that that color becomes really a three-dimensional object, meaning in this case, the apertures inside were painted green, and they were painted green probably for a similar reason. If you look through and this may sound really weird, but like a James Turrell piece, Skylight, right, which deals with a gradient of color and how that changes through in his case, a skylight, in our case, a series of apertures. So we were interested in that idea of how do you show that, and you make everything white, you wipe everything out, right? So that was really the decision making on that, and so we are interested to use it less as a surface, but more as an element that has depth to it, and that usually lets light through it. So we are interested in that. I'm not sure that answers the question.
You've explored the idea of producing thinness by getting rid of poché. How does this change the way the work is experienced for the audience?
Well, I have to say, I come out of a generation, or my history and also Scott's history in terms of working for offices, where poché was always a big part of everything we did, right? So it's like the inside's different than the outside, etc., and all the layers that are in between that. And I think to a degree, and then poché had its renaissance, not too long ago actually, where people rediscovered it. Borromini, everything became again exciting. But for us, I would say it was kind of we wanted to get rid of the poché altogether and see if we can still produce a different inside and outside, but within an 1/8 of a millimeter thickness. That was really the kind of challenge. And what we discovered actually was quite interesting, that we actually don't need that thickness to produce structure. We can use geometry to become our structure. And two, that an object on the outside and on the inside can be read differently by it reading in the SCI-Arc installation example as an aggregate of, we would call them objects. They're similar, they're self-similar, but you can read how they join together, etc. But you can read them as individual pieces and how they read as a whole. So it's a part of the whole thing. Versus on the inside, it's a continuous single space, right? So it's a very different read, like you are inside something that is multidirectional, but it's a single space, versus from the outside, you look at multiple pieces that are coming together to one piece. So, and for us, it was a very interesting experience because it was a theory at some point for Scott and myself to work on that. And then the SCI-Arc installation came along. We were like, okay, let's test that and see if that really works. And we made subtle changes, like the outside was kind of like very glossy, the inside was matte. But there was this fundamental spatial difference between those two that for us is still very exciting. And actually, the projects we're doing right now, like the Transit Center in Watsonville and the house in Hollywood. Both of them deal with the thinness of surfaces and how can it be achieved? How can geometry be used to be structural, and how the inside and outside can be very, very different by changing the way how pieces meet on the inside versus the outside.
Let's end on a fabrication note. How has the way you've approached fabrication from the start of B+U up till now changed in both model making and in thinking of literal building fabrication?
How has that changed from the beginning? I would say that has changed a lot. I mean, it continues to change, actually. I mean, part of it has, well, so our office is very keen on, you can ask everybody here, in making big models. And in part, we like that because we believe that you can really only see the space and its mistakes that you may have made in a larger model, and the closer the building gets to reality, the bigger the models get in here. The techniques of making the models have completely changed. I would say we, again, we come out of a generation that used to make a lot of things by hand, and we still do that, but it's more of a post-production thing now. I don't like the look of it looking like a 3D print. We always do something to the 3D printing. We obviously do a lot of 3D printing in here to make our models, and different types of 3D printing was depending on what you're doing. If you're producing an aperture that's very, very thin and hairy, you have something called a nylon print or ABS print. So multiple types of 3D printing. And that kind of directly then translates into how we make prototypes. How do you scale that up? That's always a big question. Is like, how scalable is that process? And I would say 3D printing has come a long way, and we are able to 3D print large parts. Although I don't necessarily think that that's the answer of how to make buildings in the future. But I do think there is a sense for to be able to have more control over the fabrication process as an architect. I think is important to us. And to be able to fabricate large parts and pieces that we can more or less control of how they are made is of interest to us. So I mean, that lately kind of translated into working a lot with composites, but also like how we move from a model that's completely 3D printed with variable techniques to combining different techniques, which we are interested in, meaning like I vacuum form things, we 3D print things, we make things by hand, and how that comes together changes immediately how that model feels and looks like. It's not like, and that's the same for architecture. I don't like to look at things and say, I know how this is done, right? But kind of for it to be more of a mystery, like how did they do that? And that's usually achieved by using multiple techniques. And I think for us, that's very much how construction and making prototypes works, advancing the level of fabrication and digital fabrication, but also mixing multiple techniques to achieve like an architectural outcome.
Herwig, I've always appreciated your comments in and out of SIRC. It was a great pleasure sitting down with you today.
Thank you.